Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk. So, I'm Danielle, I'm Assistant Manager of the NUS Baba House Outreach Team, and we're very happy that you're able to join us today. So, the talk that you have signed up to attend this afternoon is part of the Present Past Heritage Conservation Speaker Series. The series was devised to investigate the many ways in which the past and present form a dialectical relationship, creating new significances within public and personal memory. Policy, participation, documentation, and art function as lenses which unveil these economies of heritage conservation and management, and their impacts on the individual and the communities. For today's second talk in the series, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Hamza Muzaini, who will continue the series with his presentation on the concept of critical heritage from below. His focus on heritage from below, using the example of Sarawak Cultural Village in Eastern Malaysia, functions as a scholarly pivot from emphases on dominant or state heritage-making practices to the different ways in which ordinary actors too, such as heritage consumers or heritage labor, may hold and produce their own ideas of how tangible and intangible cultural heritage should be interpreted and crafted. So a short introduction on Dr. Hamza. He is a cultural geographer at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. His primary work explores the politics of remembering and forgetting, particularly as this intersects with issues of heritage, landscape, and post-coloniality. He is the co-author of Contested Memoryscapes, The Politics of Second World War Commemoration in Singapore, and he's also the co-editor of After Heritage, Critical Issues of Heritage from Below, the book of which we will be probably hearing about today. So I'll quickly pass the time over to Dr. Hamza now, who can begin your sharing. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Oh, hold on. Okay. All right, can you see that? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Danielle and the NUS Baba House for inviting me to give this talk. I almost couldn't make it today because I had high fever yesterday following my second jab. But the fever resided, so I'm feeling a bit better today. So I'm glad to be here to be able to have this little sharing session with you to talk a little bit about my work, which is focused on what is known as heritage from below. The focus of the presentation will be on exploring some of the ways in which heritage has been forged and crafted at a particular cultural theme park in Malaysia, the Sarawak Cultural Village, a site that I have been engaging with for the longest time, right? Since 1998, when I was actually an undergraduate. And it is a site that's basically managed to keep its interest for me even after 2 decades, yeah? So more than just highlighting how local Sarawak cultural heritage is formally represented at the site as part of the site's adoption of the living museum concept, I will look at how heritage is also made in other ways, on other levels, specifically from the perspectives and points of views of local Sarawakian visitors and the staff, members of the village, right? So this is towards conceptualizing what some scholars refer to as heritage from below, which takes its inspiration from scholars such as Ralph Samuel, when he wrote Theatres of Memory, and also Ian Robertson's edited volume entitled Heritage from Below, simply. So in doing so, I hope to expand the ways in which we can better understand and also analyze the manifold layers of heritage that are being made, unmade and remade at particular heritage sites on a daily basis, beyond necessarily the main remits and objectives of the cultural theme park, right? So it's really trying to broaden the way in which we look at heritage at such sites, and what we can actually learn from looking at all these other things that we can easily miss out if we are not actually specifically looking for them. So when we think about heritage, we often think about how heritage is formally made from the top down, such as on the level of the nation, right? So national heritage or global heritage, in the case of the work by UNESCO, for example. So being presenters in nature, heritage is aspects of the past that has been valued within the present as important to be preserved for contemporary purposes. And here we can be talking about tourism, education, identity building, so on and so forth. This heritage can actually be spatialized in various ways, right? So you see it in the form of our national museums, you see it in the form of our monuments, memorials, and these are often officially sanctioned by elites within society. Having said that, you do also have other kinds of museums that are not necessarily sanctioned by the state, but they still exist. And this would actually include be included as part of heritage from below as well. So it has been the contention of some scholars, though, that we have comparably not focused enough on the ways in which the people themselves or non-state agencies such as you and I too can make heritage but from below, at times differently and in our own ways. This could be on the level of the individual or even the community. And it could be done for personal reasons or accomplished by members of a community dissatisfied with more formal ways of heritage making or interpreting heritage. So in this table, we'll be looking at the other direction of the ways in which heritage can actually be made within particular sites. Having said that, we do get quite a bit of this in the literature already, especially in terms of what Turnbridge and Ashworth refers to as heritage dissonance, when people do not agree with what of the past has been preserved and how. This is especially in reference to those who express disagreement or anger even at formal heritage making endeavors, which give us what can be referred to as heritage politics or heritage activism. But what about contentions about formal heritage that has not been brought up in an antagonistic manner, that are silently held by individuals on the ground? Or how individuals may relate to heritage in ways that may quietly not align with what has been represented as formal heritage, or the ways in which non-state actors may create their own heritage within their own less public spaces or domains, or how we may manipulate heritage in ways that are different or even unauthorized from what is intended, or when the heritage made cannot be made too visible or obvious, as it may get the provocateurs in trouble. Hence, they remain hidden and kept in the shadows. And what about how heritage makes us feel beyond only what it makes us cognitively know about the past, right? So these are just some of the types of questions that I then sought to explore with the case of the Sarawak Cultural Village. This entailed focusing on my own personal experiences at the site itself over the years, looking at how it has changed over time, and investigating what people like visitors and staff members think, feel, or do while being at the site, beyond what is intended or expected. And being more observant of what type of heritages actually happens on the ground that may be missed if we were to merely consider the more so-called official types of heritage making within such tourism attractions. Yeah. So we'll be looking at shifting the focus from top-down heritage making processes to more bottom-up to try to understand exactly what people do when they are at these sites. Okay, so let's say a little bit about ethnic tourism or ethnic attractions such as the Sarawak Cultural Village. I mean, ethnic tourism is essentially travel motivated by the desire to see and experience the material, social, and performative aspects of an unfamiliar, exotic ethnic group. Following the postmodern or experiential turns in heritage tourism, this is one to see both the spectacular facets of the ethnic group as well as the mundane everyday realities. In addition, visitors tend to want to go beyond the mere superficial encounters with members of the exotic ethnic group, seeking to have a deeper engagement with them. And this is where the cultural theme park comes in. Cultural theme parks refers to enclosed spaces that contain cultural components of an exotic or indigenous group of people, tied together and promoted to the public as a coordinated package of attractions or facilities around a single theme. And they are specially established ethnographic museums that allow people to witness firsthand how the other lives, often an ethnic group that is different from them. Some of these cultural theme parks also adopt the living museum concept, where visitors will be treated to not just the material, tangible heritage of the ethnic groups, but also their so-called living or intangible heritage, such as in the form of cultural demonstrations, dance performances, storytelling, enactments, and role play by staff members enacting the daily lives of the represented group for our benefit. Visitors often also can engage the staff members directly to find out more about the ethnic group and partake in the various stage activities as well. So it does fit into the whole post-colonial post-modern turn in heritage tourism that I was talking about earlier. So scholars might say that such theme parks complement visits to actually existing villages as part of a country's ethnic tourism offering. But I would say that these theme parks also overcome many of the problems associated with visiting existing villages that are hard to get to. Such parks also reduce negative impacts on locals while still allowing visitors to learn about and be enchanted by the alterity of the ethnic groups. In the case of Sarawak, such theme parks also allow visitors to see more of the different ethnic groups in the country, given that many people would not have the time or even inclination to see the diversity of ethnic groups there. Sometimes these actually existing villages are also not open to the public, such as during funerals, hence leading to visitors disappointed when they actually get there. Visitors may also go to the villages and realize that members are not as exotic as they had pictured them, cut off from the modern world, that they would expect to see when they actually go down. So the expectation here is that visitors will see simplistic images of primitive, exotic communities, images that are born out of movies, colonial promotions, and discourses, the idea of the noble savage. But many of these longhouses, in reality, have modernized over time. And even though they do put up shows and don costumes for performances, the images in reality may not align with the images that visitors would have seen prior to being there. So here you basically just see some pictures of actually existing longhouses, and especially those that actually have tourists come and visit them, right? So this is what would be expected, and this would be the reality, right? Because things would have changed for them over time. So here is where sites such as the Sarawak Cultural Village comes in. It represents one out of the more than 20 cultural theme parks that you can find in Malaysia generally, some established by the states and others established privately. Some of you may have visited Taman Mini Malaysia in Malacca, or the Mari Mari Cultural Village in Sabah, or the Chin Sing Ling Leisure and Cultural Village in Ipoh, Perak. I remember we used to have a lot more of these types of parks in the past in Singapore, such as the Tang Dynasty, Malay Village, and the Asian Village in Sentosa. Unfortunately, these are no longer around. I think the closest that we come to such a site here today is the Haw Par Villa, although it does not really promote itself as a living museum per se. So the cultural theme park is, the Sarawak Cultural Village is an award-winning attraction established by the Sarawak Economic and Development Corporation in 1991. It is located at the Damai Peninsula, which you can see here, a dedicated area about an hour away from the capital of Kuching. It is lined by beaches with fancy resorts and opportunities to do camping, rainforest trekking, and the like. So Sarawak Cultural Village provides the cultural element to this whole package of attractions that tourists can actually enjoy while being at the Damai beach. The cultural theme tourism, or CAN tourism. You might say that this is in reference to the Malaysian Malaysia Boleh tagline, CAN meaning Boleh in Malaysia, but it actually stands for culture, adventure, nature, the three facets of the state that the tourism board has sought to promote as part of its tourism offering. The Sarawak Cultural Village includes elements of each of these facets, culture referring to the staging of the different ethnic groups in Sarawak, the nature element given the stunning beaches, the surrounding rainforest, and the location of the park at the foot of the Santubong Mountain, and the adventure in terms of what visitors can do there, such as trekking, camping, so on and so forth. The aim of the Sarawak Cultural Village is not only to provide a one-stop venue for tourists to appreciate Sarawak's diverse ethnic groups and nature, but also to preserve the state's unique tangible and intangible cultural heritage and allow Sarawakians themselves to discover their cultural heritage. So these are just some pictures, and that's Santobo Mountain, and the park is actually located at the foot of the mountain itself. Right, it's located over here. So you have all the other attractions nearby as well. So the key highlight of the Sarawak Cultural Village are the 7 houses representing the architectural uniqueness of some, but not all, of the ethnic groups that make up the state. You can see a few of the houses here, which are all arranged around the lake to represent how water is a lifeline for many of these groups. In addition to the houses, you have structures such as, among others, the restaurant, the theater where shows are put up, the main souvenir shop, although there are also businesses taking place in the individual houses as well. And mini museums such as the Rainforest World Music Gallery, which focuses on musical instruments of the different ethnic groups in Malaysia writ large. The pictures here depict the Malay house, the Chinese house, and the Rumah Melanau tall house. But you also have houses representing the Penans, the Orang Ulus, the Ibans, and the Bidayu ethnic groups. In some cases, these are the only architectural elements existing in Sarawak today. For example, one would be hard placed to find the Melanau tall house in reality, as there are not many of them left throughout the state. So it does sort of like serve that preservation kind of objective as well by having such a park here. The houses are also made in the traditional fashion using techniques and designs that you also no longer find in Sarawak today, especially given how many of these ethnic groups have modernized and used materials that are more durable than what was available before. The houses were also chosen in consultation with the communities, and when there were dissonances, the village sought to accommodate the communities, such as by including the modern elements to the Iban house, when members of the community felt that the original design was too traditional and not reflecting the ways of lives in which the community has evolved throughout time. So when you go to the Iban house, for example, which is located down here, you'll find that it's actually divided into 2 parts, one reflecting the traditional ways in which the Ibans live, and another part that shows the more modern version of how these Iban longhouses have evolved over time. So the houses are usually the first things that visitors will get to see. Aside from admiring the architectural splendors of these houses and walking along rickety traditional bridges like the one you see here, in line with the living museum concept adopted for the theme park, you also have storytellers and demonstrators stationed at each house who will show you and tell you interesting things about each house, both the tangible and intangible heritage associated with the ethnic groups, such as in terms of bead making, right, weaving, right? So this is basically somebody who makes costumes in the Bidayu house. Sorry, this is the Iban house. And you also have those who are actually making traditional cakes, and you can actually buy these cakes off them as well. And you also have people actually demonstrating things like the rice harvesting practices of the Bidayus. And so it's basically an experience whereby tourists will go to these houses and they would actually experience firsthand how some of the cultural elements are actually created. So not just shown to you, but also created, so you get to find out more about the crafts being made. And at each house, visitors are also treated to a welcome dance or a musical interlude in which they can also participate in. The picture above is the welcome dance at the Bidayu house, and the bottom is where you can see visitors taking part in the welcome dance at the Orang Ulu house. This final picture was taken at the Chinese house or Rumah Cina, where a staff member is telling the visitors about traditional Chinese medicines and spices. So these demonstrative elements are important because there are hardly any story panels within the houses. This is so as to represent the houses just as one would find them in an actual traditional village. And so the information mainly comes from the storytellers and demonstrators. In that sense, it is very much like the NUS Baba House, right? When you go down there, you don't really see a lot of storyboards or whatever that tells you about what the house is about. You basically depend on the docents, what they're to sort of like tell you more information about what that house is about. So the Sarawak Cultural Village tries as much as possible to have the houses staffed by representatives of the actual ethnic communities, so that you will be learning about the Chinese from a Chinese or about the Ibans from an Iban. Having said that, however, as you will see later, this is not always possible. After visiting the houses, visitors proceed to the air-conditioned auditorium where they are treated to a cultural performance of the different ethnic groups. Here, there are also the participatory elements, such as when a lucky visitor is invited on the stage to try the blowpipe, or at the end, where visitors are invited to join the crew for a final dance. These are all the different elements that constitute how heritage is formally staged within the Sarawak Cultural Village, both the tangible and intangible element. And it follows the living museum concept, where visitors do not only get to appreciate the tangible elements of the ethnic groups through the architecture and artifacts, but also engage the storytellers and demonstrators directly, as well as get immersed in some of the ways in which people live their lives on a more practical basis, right? But still in a somewhat superficial manner. In addition, visitors can also choose to stay a night or two in the village as part of its homestay programs, where they can engage the heritage even after opening hours in an even deeper manner. And they do have internships, and they allow students to come in, get trained within the park itself, especially for students who are interested to sort of like embark on such a career path following their education. Yeah. And they even have these kinds of packages, right? So it really attempts to try to engage people to use the park in various ways, not just as a tourism attraction, but also as a way in which actual cultural practices can be held in Sarawak. Such are the ways in which the site has been appropriated to depict the state's rich and diverse heritage, and generally visitors are happy with it. Yet not everyone agrees that it has accomplished its task in the best way possible. Hence, the first way in which heritage at the site may be unmade by the visitors to the village, each revealing their own versions of how heritage is to be depicted here. So this is referring to what I mentioned before as heritage politics, the way in which people do not necessarily agree with the way in which heritage has actually been formally represented within these sites. From my conversations with local visitors, there have been many different kinds of complaints with regards to the experiences at the site. And some of them, of course, not necessarily the fault of the sites themselves, the site itself, but still it sort of like dampens the kind of experiences that people may have at the site. Some have complained about how there is only one Orang Ulu house, right? So this picture here. And this is sort of like used to represent the more than 27 people of the interior in northeastern Sarawak, with populations ranging from less than 300 persons to over 25,000 persons, right? So it was seen to be essentializing and reductionist, given how diverse the cultures of these individual groups are. So to have basically just one house like that to represent so many different groups of people are seen to be too simplistic, right? And each of these groups would have their own ways of thinking about their heritage, which may not necessarily be aligned with how heritage is actually being formally represented within the Orang Ulu house here. Some have also commented on how the representations of groups, such as the pertains, right, over here, overemphasize too much the exoticism of the group as residents of the jungles, right? So you basically have these actors there wearing loincloths, and then they would actually have activities like blowpipe, the blowpipe, and sometimes even take people to trek behind the hut, right, where the rainforest is. In reality, however, many of the pertains have been sedentarized and no longer walk around in loincloths, right? There are also those who lamented how the Penang corner did not say much about the plights of the pertains in Sarawak today, many of them seeing their traditional villages and ways of life being threatened by development and progress. It was thus seen to be too sanitized and not reflecting reality. The interesting thing also about the pertains is that you know, what the village tries to do is to try to get actual representatives from the ethnic group to be at the site to sort of like tell their story to the village visitors. But I mentioned before that this is not always possible. So initially, when the Sarawak Cultural Village was actually established, they actually had an actual Penan family living in there, right? So they're actually living there. They're also working there, right? In terms of trying to showcase their heritage to the public. But unfortunately, every time visitors went to the Penan hut, there will be nobody there because the Penans are naturally shy people. And therefore, every time visitors came, they'll be hiding behind the hut itself. So it was not seen to be good for the Sarawak Cultural Village. So they actually removed the Penan family, and now you basically have people of other ethnicities playing the role of the Penan at the Sarawak Cultural Village. Yeah, so so the Penans have actually been replaced in that sense because they were not able to really fit into the objective that the village has set for this particular part of the village. In any case, visitors have reflected on how knowing that they are learning about an ethnic group not from representatives of the ethnic group itself does take away from the experiences generally, right? Although they do try to keep that on a hush-hush, so they don't actually want people to know that they're actually learning about the Penans from the Ibans or learning about the Bidayus from the Malays, so on and so forth. At times, when the staff members have to go prepare for the cultural performance, the houses are also left unattended without the welcome dance and such. This too makes the experiences of the houses less fulfilling for some visitors. There are also, to use Dean McCannell's term, backstages at the village where staff retires to when they are not scheduled to perform, or where visitors have and visitors have expressed how they wanted to see these backstage areas as they perceive that to be a more authentic representation of how people live in the village, especially during the time when there were many more families living in the houses themselves. So the visitors are disappointed when they were not allowed to see behind the curtains, so to speak. So people are actually, very curious, right? So when they see these staff members going somewhere else, they actually try to follow them to sort of see what's back there, right? But of course, this is not allowed because it does sort of like shatter the image, the stage image of the cultural groups that's being represented on site. Heritage from below is also obvious in terms of what the visitors themselves do while at the site. That may not necessarily go the way in which the site has actually been intended or formally intended. In fact, they may be seen to deepen the appeal of the places for them. For instance, there are visitors who reclaim the area as more than just a place of represented culture. When talking to local visitors, many reflected on how they learned about Sarawak, less from the houses, less from the exhibits and storytellers, but through their encounters with other other visitors to the site. As one visitor said here, enjoying the calmness of the place, the fresh air and the idle chatting, bersembang with a storyteller, or with other visitors you normally do not meet. I feel like I am learning about culture, not only from here, but also from other people that I meet here, right? It is also normal to encounter families walking through the Sarawak Cultural Village, adding on their own narratives to what is actually on display, right? And this is something that I imagine people actually do when they go to heritage sites as well. So I once overheard a mother relating to a son, see those farming implements. This is what your grandparents do to earn a living back in Pontianak. Pontianak is a province in Kalimantan, Indonesia. It is hard work and you do not get much in return, right? So I don't know about you, but personally, when I go to these sites, I also sort of like try to make connections between what I'm actually seeing to what what my life is like in reality. And in that sense, it actually makes people feel more of a connection, more of an attachment to the heritage that's actually being represented. And of course, you do have people from the ethnic groups themselves going down there and seeing these things and feeling a little bit more of a nostalgic kind of reaction to what is actually being represented at the site. And finally, visitors also enjoy more than just what is in the houses, but also the general atmosphere facilitated by the lake, right? And also being at the foot of the Santubong mountain. As one visitor puts it, it is so peaceful here. The nature is so beautiful, and the forest, that's what Sarawak is like. It is all green. We are not so modern that inside we are not still the peaceful and kind people that we used to be before. So we may be different culturally, but we all share this love for nature. This is a quote by a man called Ali when I was actually doing my fieldwork there. So this is interesting. If the state is to function as a tool of community building for Sarawak, it is not so much the cultural elements that will bring the diverse ethnic groups together as one, but their love of nature. Some local visitors have also reflected on how there can be more emphasis on things that will unite the ethnic groups together rather than just focusing on their differences, right? But of course, the main remit of the site is really to showcase how all these different groups are also different as well. So probably there's been a little bit too much emphasis on that rather than to sort of like see the connections between these groups of people aside from just being Sarawakian. And on any given day, visitors can also be seen not only partaking in the culture in the houses, but also sitting around the lake, sunning, or just appreciating the natural, in addition to the cultural beauty of Sarawak. What is paramount here is how these visitors relate these unchoreographed activities as what it means to be Sarawakian, right? Where there's love for nature more than culture, right? That brings the people together. Thus, much can actually be distilled from going deeper into these heritage sites and adopting a more bottom-up approach to understanding them, which is what the Heritage from Below approach seeks to do. So when you actually go down there and you actually see how the people are actually engaging with the different cultural elements at the site and seeing how they're actually making connections that may be something that the managers of these sites don't even think about, it is actually helpful, right? Because you can actually then capitalize upon this in future when you have other visitors down here. Maybe it's important to sort of like find out what they're actually expecting to see, where they're from, what their interests are, and then you can sort of like cater or choreograph the performance, the stage elements of the site based on what these people are actually expecting to see. All right. So those are basically some of the perspectives that you actually get from local visitors that actually go down that site. Now, another aspect of Heritage from Below in the Sarawak Cultural Village is from the perspectives and sentiments of the staff members themselves, or those who are responsible for the functioning of the village, right? So these are very important people because they are the ones that really materialize the living component of the living museum, right? Without these individuals there, it would just be a conventional ethnographic museum and not really fulfilling the main idea that has actually been set aside for the village. So earlier I mentioned how visitors may be disappointed when the stage heritage omits much about the actual realities and politics of the ethnic groups represented, such as with regards to the pertains. However, even though it is not part of the formal script, staff members do talk about the more insalubrious cultural realities of the ethnic groups, particularly if you ask about them. So I've witnessed staff members talking about the experience of the Penan habitats that have actually been drastically changed due to developers encroaching upon their land. This is an example of how staff members can go off script to include histories and heritage that may not be intended as part of the formal spiel. And of course, this is also dependent on how knowledgeable the staff members themselves are with regards to these outside or off-script kind of stories, right? I've also seen some of the staff members actually getting very passionate about telling the stories of how their own communities are actually being impacted by development and various other kinds of progress taking place in reality. I've also seen staff members relate to visitors how the ethnic groups may no longer practice many of the cultural elements found within the village due to processes of modernization and progress. Now, I mentioned before that when visitors go down to these kind of villages, I mean, they have certain expectations of what they're going to see at these sites. And in some ways, by talking about how in reality these cultures do not actually exist anymore, it does break the illusion that is being crafted at the site for visitors to see. So some villages, some visitors appreciate this, whereas there are also visitors who sort of like see this as something that would have, you know, changed the image that they have, right? It's not something that they appreciate. One staff also told me, right, I sometimes feel uncomfortable representing the cultural groups as if they are backwards and uncivilized. That was in the past, and many of them are not like that anymore. I prefer to tell visitors about the ethnic groups today and how they have evolved over time. So the staff members actually see this as something that's important for visitors to know, right? But not necessarily something that visitors actually want to hear, right? So staff members also become very passionate about representing their own cultures, and they would often add in many different aspects of their cultures that may not be formally represented at the houses. Again, this depends on the staff member working at these houses, right? And how much they know about their own cultures in the first place. However, at times, they are also forced to represent others' cultures, which they do not really necessarily like, right? As this one staff member said, when I talk about my own culture, I bring in my own stories, different from the set script, and make my representation personal. I cannot do that or be passionate when I'm talking about other people's cultures, which I do not know very well, right? Thus, they do feel unhappy when they're not able to always represent their own cultures, especially due to shortage of manpower, such that these workers are rotated around the village, depending on where they're needed. While they appreciate having to learn about other cultures in Sarawak, they would actually be prouder if they were allowed to just remain in the houses of their own culture, where they will be more at ease with talking about their own cultures. However, this was unavoidable given the logistical difficulties in always allowing for this. I do remember during my time as a tour guide, how I would always try to find out more information, do research, and try to create stories that may not necessarily be in the official script. So this is basically just to sort of like make the experience of the visitors more interesting, and also to be able to answer any questions that they may have with regards to what actually you're touring or talking about. Given that there is not much surveillance in the village, except for the occasional spot checks, many of them also carry on their day in the village as if they are back home rather than in a workplace. For example, it is not uncommon to see some of the people fishing in the lake. I'm talking about the workers here, resting in the houses, or just doing their own thing, even though they are supposed to be entertaining the visitors there. And it's a very huge space, right? So it's actually very difficult to sort of like know exactly what everybody is doing within the village. And this was especially the case when there used to be more families actually living in the village, where in addition to putting up a show for the visitors, they would just be getting on with their everyday lives, especially during their off days. Given their home spaces intersect also with their workspaces, visitors get to see some of these too. And in my opinion, witnessing this actually made the village more like an actual village, especially by those who have been working there for a long time and have made the village more than just a workplace. So that was actually the highlight for me, to sort of like see them just doing their own thing, rather than basically just what they're supposed to be doing at the site. Having said that, it does raise questions of privacy, intrusions, as well as just how moral it is to be constantly scrutinized by the public that way, even when the staff members are off work and do not seek to be scrutinized, right? So you do have sort of like, that kind of questions that are raised that may actually be problematic for some people. Anyway, many of the families who used to live in the houses are gone. It has changed the atmosphere in the village. It has become more of a workplace now. As this staff member said, in the past, we had Y and his family staying here. They took care of the house and really made this feel like a home. It was not an act. They were treating this house as theirs, used many of the things in the houses. This is gone, right? So some of the village workers or people have also mentioned how some of the houses are haunted, which is why they do not enter some of the rooms there, right? So I actually have the side project where I'm actually trying to put together all these different ghost stories that I've actually been hearing from the people, right? And trying to make sense of them in terms of what this actually does to the site in terms of being a tourist attraction. So one of these houses is the Melanau Tall House, which you saw earlier, where accounts of the supernatural have ranged from objects being moved on their own, as well as the sense and stories of spirits and apparitions in the rooms and so on. The house does look spooky, and I imagine it would appeal to some visitors, but it's not something that's is really included as part of the script of the house or the formal script of the house, probably for fear that it might scare some visitors from going in. And there have also been many theories as to why this is so. One account highlights how the Santubong Mountain is an area where people throw away unwanted spirits that then roam into the village. But what is clear is how this is heritage that is held on informally by the staff members, which makes them extra careful when having to deal with them. It is also common practice for staff members to practice prayers and propitiation rituals to quell whatever negative energies that may be residing in the houses. After all, locals believe that if a house is left unattended for too long, they become beacons for spirits to enter. The belief that some of the parts of the village is haunted also prevents staff members from sometimes going to some of these areas of the houses, which makes these rooms more like your conventional ethnographic museum rather than a living museum as intended. Now, you may say that all of this are indications of how things do not go to plan or failures at the Sarawak Cultural Village in terms of their aim to disseminate information about the rich cultures of the state. Yet one may also refer to these as instances whereby the area has been adopted on a more intimate register by the workers themselves, such that it emphasizes more of the living rather than the museum of the living museum. More importantly, there are visitors I spoke to who found these unscripted and unexpected aspects of the village charming, right? So even though you sort of like have maybe a couple of hours to sort of like visit all the different houses, so you go from one house to another, you make a circuit around the village. But you know, if you get really entranced in a particular house, you can actually just stay there for a long time. But of course, it is all formally choreographed, right? So you go through the houses, and then after that, you go to the auditorium for the performance, and then after that, you know, you go for lunch at the restaurant. But really, the experience of each visitor is very different. You can actually just choose to do whatever you want. You can sort of like go to the different houses in whatever order that you would like, right? So visitors themselves can also make that decision to shape their time at the site. But this may not necessarily be what has actually been intended for the site. It may actually lead to different kinds of experiences as well. Okay, so what can we learn from heritage from below, right? I think the key idea here is that we should never underestimate the different types of heritage that are being made at such places, both formally as well as informally. And this can be extended beyond just the cultural theme park, but also any other forms of heritage making sites, be it a house museum like the NUS Baba House, a museum like the National Museum of Singapore, even a nature park. Indeed, many of the sentiments here bring home the point that Tim Winter made when he said that memories and associations of visitors that are produced at heritage scapes or heritage landscapes usually extend beyond just the formal representations of the site and of the past and how people perceive these representations. It is also tied to all the different encounters that one may have with not only staff, but also other visitors where informal knowledge of local heritages, among other things, may be shared. I do remember always telling my students that when you go to a place like the National Museum of Singapore, right, you do have all this gamut of emotions that run through, right? You have annoyance when you actually have people speaking very loudly beside you. Or you know, you basically find the lights too dim or too bright or whatever, and all of these different elements actually impact your experience at these sites, right? It's not just about what is represented, but also how that representation is actually being presented to you. by the museum or any other kinds of sites. When we look closer, you do sort of like find heritage making practices that may have been missed out when we just focus on bounded and high profile sites of heritage or heritage that is in the public sphere, or merely ask people about what they think about heritage as represented, right? It goes beyond just about the heritage politics of what is actually formally represented. Following David Atkinson's advice for us to decenter the focus upon privileged bounded sites of commemoration, to think more fluidly about the ways that social memories are constituted throughout society at different scales and in mundane everyday places. So we need to extend beyond questioning how the sites have achieved their mandates as intended, which has given us the wealth of literature on heritage politics, but also to examine how people create their own heritages on the ground as well, especially in the shadows, in hidden ways, things that you would normally not know about if you are not actually looking for it specifically. It requires us to think differently about the types of questions we ask our respondents as researchers. So based on my study of the Sarawak Cultural Village, I found also not only that things as planned may not turn out as expected, which of course that is something that you would conclude, but also how these unexpected incidents and moments do add to the experiences of the visitors. Not only does this add to the appeal of the sites, but are also able to get visitors to feel more of an attachment to the site. Personally, what I remember most from my extensive engagement with the village is less about the cultural elements that are formally represented in situ, but my own personal engagements with the people of the village. For sure, I cannot equate my experiences with those of other visitors whose time spent there is usually no more than half a day. But we can still tap into this towards enhancing the little time that visitors have while there, finding out what the visitors are interested in and catering to these instead of following a set script, getting representatives from the ethnic community to talk about their own experiences and their own cultures, getting visitors to contribute narratives and providing spaces where visitors can even engage with the others, even among themselves, right? So I'm reflecting here on the fact that I actually do spend a lot of time at the village, and therefore I have had the chance to sort of see things that normal visitors will not see. I've actually even participated in some of these performances that are held in the village itself, right? So having said that, there are challenges in the form of, for example, high staff turnovers, logistical woes, and the difficulty in ensuring standards and coherence in what is, at the end of the day, a tourist attraction, right? So you do have people with different levels of knowledge, with different amount of information that they can actually tell the visitors. And therefore you would have visitors actually experiencing things differently if you do not have a standard script, right? Furthermore, even as it is tempting to romanticize these everyday formations of heritage, especially when it shows up what formal heritage making has forgotten or even purposely excised. We also need to remember to be critical too of heritage from below, right? And that is the focus of the book that Danielle mentioned at the start, right? After heritage, critical perspectives on heritage from below, right? You need to be critical of these things rather than basically just romanticizing them offhand. Like all heritage, these heritage from below instances can also be biased. They can also be forgetful. They are also partial and may be driven by ulterior motives as well. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm curious to sort of see what kind of questions that you guys have for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hamza, for that presentation. I think it helped. It tied in quite nicely as well with last week's presentation by Dr. Jet Lee, where he was looking at how built heritage needs to coexist with the intangible heritage. So today you're talking a bit more about the intangible heritage and how different relationships can even play out within that space. Yeah. So, and how the tourist I can also be a participatory third dimension in this negotiation of heritage as well.
Yeah.
So I think the first question that I wanted to ask before we open up into the Q&A was kind of a bit more about what kind of tour guide were you and how long were you, in the field site doing what you were doing?
What kind of what? Sorry, I didn't catch the first part.
Tourist guide. You said that you were participating as a tourist guide, right?
Yeah, I was a tourist guide, official Singapore Tourism Board tour guide for a while, and the kind of tours that I did was essentially the learning journeys tours that you actually have in Singapore these days. So I took a lot of students out, and essentially, it was actually good because you do sort of like see different ways in which people actually deliver information to the audience, right? Because I was also a trainer. After the whole thing, I was attached to a particular organization, and I was basically seeing how people actually can tell very different stories, right? So it's not just a matter of having one story and then you tell it in different ways, but you can also add in stuff because different people will have different knowledge attached to them. So so that has been very useful for me. But I think the thing is, and I see this a lot, which is good, right? Is that guides do sort of like ask the audience, right? Where they're from, what they would actually like to see, what they're expecting, right? And that can actually be useful to try to sort of like modify our spiel sometimes to try to meet with the expectations. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same kind of tour every time. It changes in that sense.
Yeah, right. Okay, I see how that works out as well, because I mean at the Baba House we also have a lot of different perspectives coming in at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll stop your sharing and we'll go into the general guidelines for our Zoom Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Hamza, please type your question in the Q&A tab. And we will then address it throughout the course of this conversation. So we may not have the ability to address every question in time, but we will try our best to do so. And if you have any further administrative issues, you can just let us know and we'll try and find a way to help you. Okay, so the first question that we received is from Lynn. Thank you, Dr. Hamza. Can you please share how the different intra-ethnic groups can be better represented in their intangible cultural heritage practices or narratives continue in Singapore based on your lessons learned in Sarawak's case?
Okay, let me just register that. Okay, so this is always going to be a thorny issue. Especially in a place like Singapore or Sarawak, right? Because of the multiracial realities of the nation itself. What I've learned from the Sarawak Cultural Village is that there is certainly appreciation from learning about the cultures from members of the group itself, right? So if I wanted to say in Singapore's case, right? So if I want to learn about Chinese, and I want to sort of like learn from a Chinese person, or if I want to learn about the Peranakans, it's always good to sort of like hear from a Peranakan's point of view. Having said that, these groups will also have very differing levels of engagement with these cultural practices themselves. So it's actually very difficult to do that. So how they can actually be better represented is when you actually get the representations done by the communities themselves, right? And to ensure that, you sort of like get as much feedback as possible from these communities and to try to even sort of like foresee any kinds of complaints that actually may emerge. You will never be able to get a kind of representation that's going to be happy, that's going to make everyone happy. But I think it's just a matter of putting in that effort to try to find out more about how the community itself wants their heritage to be represented. One of the things, one of my pet peeves in Singapore is how you do have this attempt to try to reach out to the public to get their perspectives, but it's always done much later, down the line, right? I think this should be the first thing to try to understand exactly how they want their cultures to be represented, and then after that, shaping the representation in a museum or a cultural theme park or whatever in a way that would actually then align with what they expect. Hope that answers the question. Yeah, especially with intangible cultural heritage, right? I mean, you do have many different types, ways in which certain things can actually be done. So to just be very, very open to how there can be different ways in which things are done, and to try to not fix things in a particular way, because there's no such thing as a traditional something, right? It is always something that's going to be different for different people.
I think in relation to that, there's also this other question about, okay, first this person thanks you for your interesting presentation. And after that, looks a bit about authenticity, because how is authenticity then negotiated in this tourist site? Or what is your take on it? So I think you did mention a bit about it when answering this question, but do you have any further comments?
Yeah, you know, when I teach my students about heritage in Singapore, anywhere in Southeast Asia, I always tell them to avoid using the A word, which is one of my least liked words ever. Authenticity. You know, when we're talking about sites like this, authenticity is always going to be something that's contested. And you have to sort of admit that when you go to sites like this, right, it's always going to be staged authenticity. It's always going to be somebody else's version of authenticity that you're seeing, right? And yeah, it can make you angry when it's actually not the idea of authenticity that you may actually have. But generally, if you sort of go back to scholars like Dean McCannell, I mean, visitors, I think more or less are very forgiving in terms of seeing something that they may not necessarily see as authentic. So part of the authenticity here is basically having the people themselves talk about these sites or their culture. Authenticity can also be in terms of having actual artifacts that are there. So this is more of the objective kind of authenticity, right? So things that are actually used in reality and then brought into the site. But at the end of the day, I think it's very much about the experience, right? So if you saw see how, and this is basically where scholars are actually going as well. When you're looking at something that is, the experience that the people are having are authentic, right? You shift the focus from thinking about the objects or even the representation as being authentic, but the authenticity of how this information is actually being delivered to the audience and how the audience is actually taking it. So I think that's basically where authenticity actually lies, which I put a lot more purchase in. Because I think that, you know, yeah, it's a very difficult question to ask, simply because there are many different ways in which authenticity itself can actually be defined, right? And people will have different ideas about it.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. I think in relation to that, there was a question by Lisa in the chat about how much does management intervene in representation? So I'm assuming it's something in relation to the management of the Sarawak Cultural Village.
I don't see the question.
It's in the chat. So it's
in the chat.
Yeah.
By Lisa, you say. Oh God. Okay. How much does management intervene in representation? So at the Sarawak Cultural Village, they generally do not intervene that much, right? There have been periods whereby the management did not even allow for businesses to take place at each house, because it sort of takes business away from the souvenir shop that they have. But they've changed that quite some years ago. So say, okay, if you were to do that, then essentially we'll just get a commission out of it, or we provide the raw materials and then you provide it and then you sell it at the sites itself. So they have somewhat come to an agreement in terms of how to do that. And you do sort of have a set script in terms of what actually needs to be said at the site and what sort of information that needs to be told down. But I think, yeah, from what I've experienced, there have been cases where they're going around just checking these stories, especially when they're actually in training stage. But subsequently, I think less so. And I think this is basically what has given the opportunities for the people to sort of just play around with the information that they can actually tell these people. Having said that, you do have people who tell the visitors more, right? But you also have others who do not, right? So you also have people who are there, but they're not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So they're supposed to be giving more information, but then they basically just, do not. And so you can't really control. I think where there is intervention and where there is a kind of attempt to try to streamline the choreography within the houses is when people are not delivering what they're supposed to be doing. And I think, and from what I've observed, is that when they're actually talking about some of the more sensitive stuff with regards to Sarawak culture, it is actually done when the management is not there, right? So they developed that trust in me in terms of, so like saying things in front of me, even if it's not something that they're supposed to be saying at the side.
Okay. This, then is connected to one Kian Lo's question about what kind of training are given to the staff before they're put on the job, and to what extent are staff allowed to go off script. So one of your examples was that they confide in you when no one else is around. But for other visitors, how often do they go off script? What kind of preparation for visitors is useful prior to the visit?
Yeah, in a quantitative manner, I can't tell you because I'm not able to solve it for everyone. And sometimes they go off script and sometimes they do not. So it's not easy to sort of like answer that question. But each time you have a new staff, right, then what happens is that they're actually then given a role, right? So you can be a storyteller, you can be a demonstrator. Demonstrator will not be expected to talk too much. The storyteller is the main person who basically goes around the house, taking the visitors around the house and telling them about the culture. And they would actually then be given a script, and they would actually then shadow a more experienced guide, right? A more experienced storyteller around the house, and then after that, then do it on their own. And then the first few times, then they would have this mentor with them, just to make sure that they're actually telling the story as intended. And then after that, they do it themselves, right? So so that's the kind of training that they have at the site. But it really depends on the kind of roles that you have. Having said that, you do also have the necessity of getting people to be able to guide not only at that particular house, but also at other houses. For example, when you have Gawai, which is the Dayak festival in Sarawak, then a lot of the Dayak ethnic groups would actually be on leave, right? So you need the Malays and the Chinese to be able to take over their roles. So you have these kinds of logistical issues that necessitates them knowing about the other cultures as well, to be able to sort of like make sure that the site is still running. And so the training would extend to basically learning about more than just one house, so various houses within the village.
Okay, so maybe we'll then move on to the more built heritage part. So we've got 3 or so questions who are looking at the concept of the village, the building. So the first question is, why is there decline in such cultural villages in Singapore? Same time, I think forcing them to re-emerge would be inauthentic or potentially misappropriated. How do you negotiate that?
Yeah, so this is a question I get my students to think about a lot, right? I think the decline in such cultural villages in Singapore is because there is just not enough interest in these sites anymore. You have to imagine that places like Haw Villa, for example, right, came about because at that point in time there were no recreational areas at all in Singapore. So so they do provide that attraction for people to go and visit it. But over time, there's actually been a lot more of these sites, right? Such that maybe cultural villages are no longer something that people actually want to go and see. So that's one theory that I have, which is probably also explaining why it was so difficult to get Haw Villa to get restarted again. So I'm hoping that with all the recent changes, that things would actually change for Haw Villa. But you also have the fact that it is actually very, it's actually a very, it requires a lot of intensive kinds of investments on having these sites. You need to sort of like not just manage a site, right? You need to train people to do whatever that they're supposed to be doing. And I wonder whether that is also another reason why these sites don't actually, they don't really want to make that kind of investment, especially if they don't see that there is actually a demand for it.
As I mentioned, if somebody doesn't have that connection to want to participate in it.
Yeah. So I'm basically just thinking about, places like Malay Village, right? And how, so it's kind of interesting because it didn't really, at the end of the day, function as a cultural theme park per se, right? I know theme park, some people would have an issue with calling it a theme park, right? But it is basically a park that's actually got a theme attached to it. But yeah, there isn't that much interest. I think that's the bottom line. The sentiment that the younger generations especially will not appreciate these sites as the older generations used to in the past. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, the second part of it, yeah, definitely. Again, authenticity, inauthenticity is something that's quite questionable, but it's not something that you should force to re-emerge, I imagine. But I think it's just a matter of trying to sort of, again, go back to what I said before, right? You need to understand from the community whether there is a need for such a thing. And when you do have that answer and how they would like their cultures to be represented, then maybe you can think about what such a site may look like. But one more thing that just came to mind, right, is how people these days also probably want to have a more realistic, authentic, if you will, way of experiencing these cultures, right? And they don't see themselves getting it from a place like a cultural village, right? So we may probably think about other ways in which culture can actually be represented in a better way.
Great. So it's also very related to kind of tourism trends as well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, the next question is about, hi Dr. Hamza, I am looking at the Chinese house and the Malay townhouse. So how are majority races in terms of Malaysia as a whole represented in such a site? Were there any heritage contestations when Peninsular or overseas visitors engaged with interpretation in this village?
Hi, Ian. Okay, so this is an interesting question, right? Because in reality, of course, Sarawak is part of Malaysia, all right? So it's very much bound by all the different rules and regulations with regards to Malaysia as a whole. But from my conversations with the people working at the Sarawak Cultural Village, they see themselves as different from Peninsular Malaysians. And they sort of like see the village as a representation of how there's a lot more diversity in the cultures. I think this attempt to try to sort of like, pigeonhole or classify different races, in Peninsular Malaysia is sort of like frowned upon by people in Sarawak. So what's interesting is that when you actually have Peninsular Malaysians going to Sarawak Cultural Village, they're actually treated as tourists. They're not treated as local visitors, which is already kind of interesting. And when you should go down there, there is actually a lot of things that I hear from people talking about where they actually see themselves as not the same as Peninsular Malaysians, right? So there is definitely that kind of heritage contestation with regards to Peninsular visitors coming to that site. So even formally, right, because of the entrance fees that they actually have to pay, they are already seen as different. But when they go down there, you do sort of like have this impression that the Sarawakians basically see themselves as unique. I'm not going to go into the whole politics of it, right, between Sarawak and between East Malaysia and West Malaysia. But you do sense that kind of contestation going on within the site.
Okay, we'll save this long question for the last. So before that, there's another question about what are some of the controversies in ethnic tourism? I think you answered quite a few of them already as we went along. But is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah. Controversies in ethnic tourism. I've brought up quite a few examples, right? So especially in terms of the way in which heritage or ethnicity or culture is actually being represented, there's always going to be contestations. But you do have the more general question of just how morally right it is to actually have such a site, especially in the early years when they actually got actual communities to live in the village and also to work as storytellers or whatever. It's almost sort of like reminiscent of the human zoos of yore, right? So there's always going to be, there's always going to be that kind of question being raised. But, especially in more recent years, you sort of like see that people who are there, they want to be there. So they're actually getting something out of it, right? So you can sort of like see this as a kind of Orientalist kind of attraction, but taking the concept of re-Orientalism, it is basically the people deciding to do it to try to get benefits for themselves, which in that sense gives them the agency to do whatever that they want within that site. So they're not being made to be showcased in that respect. Other controversies would be in terms of the depiction of the ethnic group as being modern or being backwards, right? So I mentioned the example of the Iban house, how people are saying you cannot represent our culture that way because it shows that we're still headhunters, that we're still living in houses with all these traditional materials and all that, which is not the case in reality. We have actually moved away from that. So when you actually have a storyteller that sort of like tells you or gives you the context of how people have changed over time, then it's fine. But you may also have situations where visitors would leave the house thinking that that's basically how the people are still living today, right? So it's very much about the kind of stories that are being told and just how concise and how how comprehensive the storyteller actually tells you about a particular site. I can go on and on. I mean, there's so many different kinds of controversies with regards to ethnic tourism.
I think that's like a very good angle to which we approach the last question, because we're looking at how these tourism sites are criticized for being dignified, as you earlier said, all these controversies. And so how can compared house like the Baba House not fall into this trap?
Get people to live in it. It's kind of hard because that's essentially what the Baba House is, isn't it? A lot of the different sites as well. You're basically representing culture in a particular way. But what I like about the Baba House, and this is something that I've experienced, is that the people are very passionate. So it's very much about the people who are actually telling you the stories about these sites, and they actually make it interesting for the people. And not to Disneyfied. So I don't know how to answer that question really, because you will always have different kinds of expectations that people will have. Some people would, be happy with something that's a lot more Disneyfied. It's very much about, so this goes back to my response to the authenticity question, right? If the visitors go to these sites and they feel as if that the experiences are good, right? Then I think the site would have done its job, right? It's very much about how they experience it, how they learn, what they learn about, and the kinds of experiences that they have at the site. I think in terms of the site itself, it is staged, right? You go to the kitchen of the Baba House, it is staged, right? You don't have anybody cooking there, for example. So that's a very difficult question to answer. But I think it's very much about the experiences actually being created at the site more than it is about the site itself that people actually would find a lot more important.
As you mentioned, it's kind of like the layering as people find from the storytellers. So I think at the end of the day, you try to piece together the story based on what you see, from what you hear.
Yeah, and the people will have different expectations. The people would have different kinds of needs and demands, right? So there is no way that you can actually foresee what the people actually want to see at these sites. And it's very much about trying to understand from them exactly what they want to see, and then trying to cater to those demands in the way we should present that heritage.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. So sorry about Irene's question. But we will go on to wrap up and thank Dr. Hamza once again for this very amazing talk and as well as the conversation that we had. So our audience hope that learn a bit more about the representation of heritage from below, Sarawak Cultural Village and its relationships within it as well. So I'll just end off by saying that this particular talk and is actually devised in a lineup to the APRU University Museum's Research Symposium at the end of the year, which looks at universities and architectural heritage, along with a lot of other different topics relating to architecture and sustainability. So if you are interested in submitting something for it, please do take a look at the website. And the next few talks that are coming up in the series are an archaeology of the present, seeing the unseen by Dr. Iriata Tali, as well as automation memory and recording. So we're actually going to look at Alpha through Dr. Eric Kerr's presentation. So they are also up for signing up. But other than that, that is all from us today. So thank you so much for joining us, and please do fill in the feedback form as you are leaving the webinar. So thank you so much. Have a good evening ahead.
Thank you.